What if I told you that the greatest battle in the Wild West was not fought against bandits or enemies, but against the heavens themselves? Settlers pushing westward dreamed of new lands and freedom, but instead found themselves in the midst of a force that knew no mercy. On the endless plains, they were completely alone, with no forests, hills, or mountains to shelter them from even a fraction of the destructive power of the heavens. Every night, they went to sleep as if on a battlefield, because the weather itself could be their final enemy. These were lands where silence could turn into roaring chaos in a second. In winter, blizzards shut the world off for weeks, turning homes into white prisons. In summer, sudden storms and tornadoes tore roofs off and carried away everything that people considered theirs. Settlers learned to listen to the wind as attentively as others learned to read. Any rustle, any jolt, any change in the sound of the night could be a harbinger of disaster. Their sleep was no longer restful. It became part of their survival strategy. Watch the video to the end to find out how these families turned their huts into fortresses against storms. What unexpected secret allowed them to stay sane on nights when the walls shook from the wind, and why victory over the elements became the greatest feat of the Wild West. What if I told you that everything you believed about the safety of homes on the frontier was untrue? The most important and constant enemy of settlers on the Great Plains was an invisible adversary, the wind. It was not just a breeze, it was a continuous, roaring stream of air pouring across the continent without any barriers in the form of mountains or forests. At night, this wind turned into something primal, an ocean storm raging over a sea of grass. It penetrated the consciousness, affecting the psychological state of every inhabitant of the plains. The sound was deafening and constant. Settlers described it in their diaries not as a whistle, but as a low hum, a moan, or even a scream. This sound did not stop for an hour or a day. It frayed the nerves, making sleep shallow and restless. People woke up from a sudden increase in the gust, thinking that a tornado was beginning, although it was just a normal night in Nebraska or Kansas. This wind dictated everything from the location of the house to minor household habits. Windows were made small and placed on the leeward side, if possible. Any crack in a wall or door became a source of a piercing whistle that drove people mad. The struggle for silence in the house was as important as the struggle for warmth. The wind carried not only sound, but also cold. In winter, it instantly blew any warmth out of poorly constructed dwellings. Families huddled around the stove, but as soon as they took a couple of steps away, an icy draft penetrated to the bone. At night, people slept under all the blankets they had, often fully clothed, trying to retain the warmth accumulated during the evening. In summer, the wind brought another problem: suffocating dust. It lifted dry soil and carried it for hundreds of miles. This dust got everywhere, covering food, water, and bedding with a thin layer. Women woke up in the morning with a feeling of sand on their teeth and spent hours cleaning, which by evening became pointless. The psychological pressure was enormous. Some historians even identify a specific condition known as prairie syndrome, a deep melancholy caused by isolation and constant wind. At night, when darkness hid the already monotonous landscape, only this pervasive hum remained. It was the first element that settlers had to overcome in order to simply fall asleep. The constant struggle with the wind-shaped character, it taught patience and endurance. People got used to this sound. It became the background of their lives. But even after getting used to it, they always listened for changes in it, because the slightest change in tone could mean the approach of a real storm. The architecture of the plains was a direct response to this challenge. The settlers could not stop the wind, so they decided to hide from it. They began to build houses that were not just shelters, but part of the land itself. These structures were low-slung, sturdy, and almost silent inside. That is why the first and most common dwelling on the plains was not a wooden log cabin, but something much more primitive and at the same time ingenious. It was a house built from the only material available: grass. It became the first fortress in the war against the wind. We are very interested to hear your opinion. What do you think was worse for those settlers? The physical cold and dust, or the constant psychological pressure of the wind? Write about it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next chapters of our story. Are you ready to learn the truth about the most iconic dwelling of the frontier? When settlers arrived on the Great Plains, they found a complete absence of trees, but beneath their feet was a unique building material. This material was the earth itself, covered with a thick layer of sod with densely intertwined grass roots. They cut this sod into long strips similar to bricks, using a special plow. These sod bricks, called sod, became the foundation of their homes, known as soddies. The construction process was incredibly labor-intensive. First, a site was chosen, usually on a small slope for better drainage. Then a special plow was used to cut the sod into strips about 4 to 6 inches thick. These strips were then cut into 2 to 3 foot long pieces. Each of these bricks could weigh anywhere from 50 to 100 pounds. The walls were laid like ordinary brickwork, in 2 or even 3 rows to achieve maximum thickness. They were often laid with the grass facing down so that the roots could continue to grow and strengthen the wall even more. The gaps between the sod blocks were carefully filled with clay or earth to prevent drafts. The thickness of such walls could reach 2 to 3 feet. Such a massive structure had phenomenal properties. First, it was incredibly durable. A properly constructed soddy could withstand hurricane-force winds that easily knocked down wooden buildings. The walls were too heavy to be moved, and the low profile of the house prevented the wind from catching it. Second, the sod house had excellent thermal insulation. The thick earthen walls worked like a thermos. In the summer, when the plains were sweltering, the sod house remained pleasantly cool inside. In winter, during fierce blizzards, the walls retained the heat from the only cast iron stove, allowing the family to survive the cold. For the roof, they used rare logs that they managed to bring from far away, or thicker layers of turf laid on a frame of branches. The roof was also covered with turf on top, and grass often continued to grow on it. This made the house virtually indistinguishable from the surrounding landscape. Inside such a house, it was very quiet. The massive earthen walls almost completely absorbed the deafening howl of the wind. For settlers exhausted by constant noise, a night in a sod house was a real salvation. They could sleep in silence, hearing only the crackling of the fire in the stove and the breathing of their family. Windows were a luxury. Glass was expensive and had to be brought from far away. Therefore, the windows were made very small, which made the house resemble a bunker. The only door was the most vulnerable part of the structure, and they tried to make it as strong as possible, covering it with all available materials. Life in such a house was far from ideal. It was often dark and damp inside, but in terms of surviving a storm, it was the perfect shelter. The family, locked inside during the storm, felt safe. They didn't sleep through the storm. They slept inside a fortress that the storm couldn't overcome. However, this earthen fortress had one critical flaw that became apparent during another type of storm. What if I told you that the main threat to this house came not from outside, but from above, turning sleep into a waiting for disaster? In the next chapter, we will reveal the secret that turned the cozy soddy into a dirty trap. I will reveal the settlers' best-kept secret. Their homes were often more dangerous than the storm itself. A sod house was almost invulnerable to wind, but it was completely defenseless against water. The prolonged rains that often accompanied spring and fall storms on the plains turned this earthen fortress into a source of constant discomfort and even despair. The problem was the roof, which was virtually impossible to make waterproof. The sod roof usually consisted of wooden rafters covered with branches, a layer of pressed grass, and then thick layers of turf. As long as the weather was dry, this construction worked perfectly. But as soon as it started to rain, water slowly seeped through the ground and began to drip inside. It was not a rapid leak, but a slow, methodical seepage that could last for several days. The settlers described how the rain inside the house began several hours after it started outside and continued for another day after the sky cleared. The water, passing through layers of earth and roots, turned into a thick brown sludge. It dripped everywhere, covering furniture, food, and beds with a sticky layer of dirt. Sleeping in such conditions was practically impossible. Families placed buckets, pots, and basins throughout the house to collect the dripping water. The sound of monotonous dripping mixed with the sound of rain hitting the ground outside. People tried to find a dry corner by moving beds, but leaks could start anywhere at any time. The housewives were in despair. They tried to protect their few valuables by covering them with oilcloth or wax cloth, if they had any. Often, the only way to keep the bed dry was to open an umbrella over it, if there was one. This image, an umbrella opened inside a house, became a bitter symbol of life in a sod house. The floor, made of compacted earth, turned into a veritable swamp. The clay soil of the plains, known as gambo, became incredibly sticky and viscous. It was only possible to move around the house by sinking into the mud. This mud stuck to shoes and clothes, making basic hygiene impossible. At night, the family went to bed in damp, cold beds, listening to mud dripping from the ceiling. It was not only a physical ordeal, but also a moral one. The storm did not threaten their lives like a tornado, but it deprived them of basic human comfort and dignity. It was a slow siege waged by ordinary water. Some settlers tried to combat this by laying boards on the roof or even coating it with tar. But this was expensive and required materials that were not available on the plains. Most simply accepted it as an inevitable part of life. They knew that after the storm, the sun would come out, the roof would dry, the mud would harden, and life would return to normal. This unique experience of living inside the storm was unknown to people in other regions. It showed that sheltering from one natural disaster could make you vulnerable to another. The settlers learned to appreciate dry weather like no one else. But there was another category of settlers who found an even more radical way to shelter from the storm. They decided not to build on the ground, but to build in the ground. These dwellings were even more resistant to wind and even quieter. If you like this story about battling the elements, please like this video. What if I showed you a time machine that would take us to the safest dwelling in the frontier? For many settlers, especially those who arrived late in the fall or without any resources, their first home was a dugout, a shelter carved into a hillside or ravine. It was the most primitive shelter, but also the most reliable when it came to the fury of the elements. In the world of the Great Plains, where tornadoes could wipe out an entire farm in minutes and winter turned the surrounding area into a white desert, a dugout was not just a home, it was a refuge of last hope. A dugout was essentially a cave dug into the ground. Steep riverbanks, cliffs, ravine sides, or natural hillsides were chosen for construction. These locations were ideal. The soil itself formed the walls, and the slope provided natural drainage, which protected against flooding during the spring floods. Armed only with a shovel, a pickaxe, and his own stamina, the settler dug out a room of the desired size. It took days of hard work, but the result appeared quickly and required no money, only labor and patience. The only part of the dwelling visible above ground was the facade. It was constructed from turf, laying dense blocks of grass in the same way as in the construction of a sadi. If a settler was particularly lucky, he could get a few logs or boards from a dismantled wagon to reinforce the front of the dugout. An opening for a door and one or two tiny windows, needed more for psychological comfort than for lighting, were cut into the facade. These windows were narrow and deep, like loopholes, and let in only a faint strip of light. The roof was a true work of necessity. Logs, poles, or thick branches, often from the nearest grove, were laid on the upper edges of the recess. A layer of grass, brushwood, and hay was laid on top, and then covered with a thick layer of turf. Over time, the roof grew together with the hill so that the house became invisible. The grass turned green, the roots strengthened the roof, and the dugout became an extension of the slope itself. Such a dwelling seemed not to have been built, but dug out by nature. Life in a dugout was even darker, damp, and more confined than in a sod house. It always smelled of damp earth, sometimes mold, sometimes smoke from a small stove. The walls could crumble at the slightest vibration, and the ceiling creaked under the weight of wet turf. But when a hurricane raged outside or a tornado approached, all these inconveniences turned into blessings. The earth, cold and heavy, became an impenetrable barrier between the family and the fury of the wind. Inside the dugout during a tornado, there was an almost unreal silence. Outside, the roar of the wind could drive you mad, breaking trees and lifting boards and branches into the air. But under several meters of soil, this chaos was muffled to a distant, steady hum, reminiscent of the sound of the sea. People sat in the dim light, listening to the world above them being destroyed, and understood that their home would not be blown away by the wind because it did not stand on the ground. it was the ground. In winter, the dugout also showed its best qualities. A blizzard could completely cover it with snow, sometimes so much so that the entrance disappeared under several meters of snowdrifts. And yet inside, near a tiny iron stove, the family sat warm. Paradoxically, the snow served as additional insulation, turning the dwelling into a real natural thermos chamber. People remained safe as long as there was enough fuel and food, and children often remembered these winters as the coziest, despite all the difficulties. Psychologically, sleeping in a dugout was special and left a deep impression on the memory. It was a return to something primitive, to a burrow, a cave, a shelter where humans first experienced cold and night thousands of years ago. People went to bed feeling not a thin roof above them, but a whole hill, the whole weight of the earth that protected and sheltered them. This feeling was especially appreciated by those who had seen the devastating effects of tornadoes. Wooden houses disappeared like toys while dugouts remained intact. Of course, there were infinitely more disadvantages than advantages. In the spring, meltwater could seep through the walls, turning the floor into sticky mud. The darkness was oppressive, and the lack of ventilation made the air heavy and stuffy. In summer, the dugout was filled with insects, and in autumn, small animals could settle in it. That is why dugouts were more often built as temporary housing, an intermediate stage on the way to a normal home. And yet many families lived in them for years, sometimes decades. It was the cheapest, fastest, and most reliable housing on the frontier. It provided a roof over their heads within days of their arrival and offered a level of safety that even well-built wooden houses could not boast. People learned to sleep peacefully amid the roar of tornadoes, knowing that the worst that awaited them was a small wall collapse, not the complete destruction of their world. Would you feel safer knowing that you were sleeping underground, beneath a thick layer of living soil? Or would you be frightened by the thought of being buried alive? In the next chapter, we will see what happened when the earth itself, that very shelter, became a threat. When it began to move, creep, and settle, trying to swallow the house and those who lived in it. There is a period in the history of the frontier that stands apart. The 1930s, the era of the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl. By this time, the settlers of the Great Plains had mostly moved from dugouts and sod houses to lightweight frame houses built of boards. These houses were a symbol of progress and civilization, but they proved completely defenseless against a new type of storm, the Black Blizzard. Dust storms were caused by catastrophic drought and decades of improper plowing, which destroyed the grass cover that held the soil in place. The wind, which had always blown across the plains, now lifted millions of tons of topsoil into the air. At night, these storms turned into an apocalyptic spectacle. A family going to bed in their wooden house would hear the storm approaching. It was not a whistle, but a low, ominous rumble. Even at night, the sky grew even darker, taking on a brown or yellow hue. Then a squall would blow in, carrying not rain or snow, but dust as fine as flour. The light frame houses were completely unsealed. Dust penetrated through every crack, around window frames, under doors, through floorboards, and even through keyholes. In a matter of minutes, the air in the house became thick and unbreathable. Visibility dropped to a few feet. It was impossible to sleep in such conditions. Housewives tried to seal their homes by plugging the cracks with wet rags and newspapers. They hung wet sheets on windows and doors in the hope that they would filter the air. But the dust was too fine and passed through the fabric. At night, people woke up suffocating. They breathed through wet scarves, but it did little to help. By morning, all surfaces in the house, including beds and sleeping people, were covered with a thick layer of brown dust. People woke up with their noses and mouths clogged, coughing up dirt. The experience was psychologically devastating. The house, which was supposed to be a refuge, no longer provided protection. The elements penetrated inside, and there was no hiding from them. People felt as if they were being buried alive under tons of flying earth. The light from kerosene lamps barely penetrated the dusty haze in the rooms. Families often sat together all night in the kitchen, the most airtight room in the house, listening to the howling wind and the pounding of sand on the walls. It was like a siege that could last for several days in a row. The static electricity that built up in the dry, dust-filled air reached incredible levels. Blue sparks jumped from one metal object to another. People were afraid to touch door handles or the stove for fear of getting a painful electric shock. Sleep was short and restless. People dozed fitfully, sitting at the table or leaning against the wall. In the morning, they had the exhausting task of sweeping the dust out of the house. They carried it out in buckets, but they knew that the storm could return the following night. It was a unique test that Frontier had prepared for its last settlers. They were experiencing not just a storm, but an ecological disaster. Their sleep was disturbed not by fear of the wind, but by the physical impossibility of breathing in their own homes. Are you ready for the shocking truth about winters in the Wild West? If dust storms were the hell of the 1930s, then throughout the 19th century, the Great Plains' main winter nightmare was the blizzard. It wasn't just snowfall. It was a deadly combination of hurricane-force winds, a sudden drop in temperature, and dry, icy snow that flew not downward, but horizontally, like millions of tiny needles. A night in such a storm was not a weather event, but a test of human will. The onset of the blizzard was often so sudden that it seemed supernatural. A clear, frosty day with crisp snow could turn into a boiling white abyss in a matter of minutes. People dropped everything, herded their livestock, slammed the door of their sod house or log cabin, and realized that they would be under siege for the next few hours, or even weeks. It was a winter blockade, and the winner would be whoever could keep their house warm. All life revolved around the cast iron stove, the only source of light and heat. It was the heart of the home, the sacred center on which the life of the entire family depended. But the problem of fuel presented people with a daily challenge. On the boundless plains, wood was a luxury that was inaccessible to most. Settlers burned the rare firewood brought from many miles away, dried manure, bundles of dry grass, corn cobs, anything that gave off even a little heat. Sometimes they had to break old boxes, take boards from the fence, or tear up the floorboards at the entrance, just to keep the fire from going out. At night, someone always stayed on duty. Falling asleep together meant risking freezing to death. As soon as the stove went out, within an hour the house turned into an ice cave. The person sitting by the fire listened to two sounds: the piercing howl of the wind outside and the occasional crackling of semi-dry fuel inside the stove. These sounds told him everything he needed to know about a world where survival was the only occupation. The walls of the soddy were excellent at retaining heat, but weak spots were inevitable. Windows, doors, gaps between sod blocks. Snow rushed in, driven by the wind with such force that it clogged the inside of the house through openings as thin as a needle. Small snowdrifts accumulated along the walls. The bucket of water standing by the door was covered with ice, while near the stove, it was as hot as summer. Outside, the house disappeared. It was completely submerged under a white sea. Snowdrifts tens of feet high covered the roof, pressed down on the entrance, and turned the dwelling into a white capsule. The family lived under the snow, as if in an underground den, and they had only one connection to the outside world. A rope stretched from the door to the barn. This rope was literally a lifeline. The man had to go out. The cattle had to be fed. The wind could kill the animals faster than hunger if they were left unattended. The settler tied the rope around himself, bent his head, and blindly made his way to the barn. There was no horizon, no ground, no sky. There was only white nothingness. If he let go of the rope, he could die a few steps from his own home. At night, the family lay in their beds, listening to the storm trying to tear the earth apart. The sound was almost inhuman, a mixture of screeching, roaring, the pounding of frozen snow, and the dull thuds of the wind hitting the walls. This sound was not background noise. It was a rival, an enemy that the house was facing. People tried to hear if the storm was subsiding, but more often than not, they realized that the night would be long. The most frightening enemy was the lack of air. When the house was covered with snow up to the roof, ventilation disappeared. The air quickly became saturated with smoke, carbon dioxide, and moisture. People began to suffocate. They had to open the door for a moment, and an icy whirlwind rushed into the house, flooding everything with snow. But this gave them a few minutes of air, during which the stove had time to heat the room again. Sleep on such a night was not restful. It was a semi-conscious state, heavy, anxious, interrupted by coughing, chills, and the noise of the storm. People slept fully clothed, wrapped in skins like armor. All the while, they knew that their lives depended on the thickness of the turf walls, the remaining logs, whether the roof would hold, and whether the stove could survive another night without breaking down from the damp fuel. How long would you last in such conditions? Could you get up in the middle of the night, when the world around you roars like a raging beast, and go check the furnace, knowing that the firewood is running out and the storm is not letting up? In the next chapter, we will leave the plains and go where the storm met not endless grass, but endless forests and mountains, and learn how those who face the elements head-on survived. If the settlers of the plains feared open spaces and wind, mountain hunters or trappers faced a different enemy: isolation and weight. Winter in the Rocky Mountains was long, quiet, and incredibly snowy. The storms here were not so much violent as persistent, capable of burying the gorges under meters of snow. This silence and slowness made the elements particularly dangerous. They could imperceptibly sap a person's strength and trap them far from any trails. The trappers, who were the first explorers of the West, did not build sod houses. Their winter shelters were either temporary or small, but sturdy log cabins. They often built them in secluded valleys, protected from direct winds, near a stream that did not freeze. Strong gusts of wind rarely reached such places, and it was possible to find some dry firewood. The main task was to survive not just one night, but the entire season, which could last up to half a year. Hunters chose a site for construction in advance, carefully assessing the slope, the availability of trees, and the proximity of water. They knew that even a weak stream could save their lives if it did not freeze completely. The hut was built as tightly as possible because every gap became a crack through which the cold penetrated. Sometimes trappers used earth and snow as an extra layer of insulation. In this way, they turned their temporary dwellings into veritable fortresses against winter. When a storm began, the trapper found himself completely isolated. Snow fell for weeks, silently accumulating around the hut. Unlike on the plains, there was often no deafening howl of the wind here, only the quiet rustle of falling flakes. This silence could be as oppressive as the roar of a storm. Outside, landmarks disappeared and any movement became risky. Over time, the hunter learned to understand the behavior of the weather from the slightest signs. He could predict when the clouds would thicken and when the snow would become particularly heavy. This knowledge did not come immediately, but was formed over years of observation. The storm became not just a danger, but a constant companion of winter life. Because of this, the trapper often prepared firewood and food in advance, trying to survive the hardest weeks. The trapper's sleep during such a snow blockade was deep and long. He did not need to constantly fear tornadoes or sudden drops in temperature. His enemies were hunger and cold, penetrating through the logs. Therefore, his whole life boiled down to keeping the fire burning in the hearth and preserving provisions. He had to be careful that the fire did not go out at the most inopportune moment. The supplies he had brought in the fall became a real treasure. Dry grass, dried meat, and a little flour could determine his fate. If there was little food, he had to save every bite, trying to stretch it out for weeks. Sometimes trappers even cooked soup from old bones to get a little warmth and strength. Sleep brought brief relief, but it was a constant reminder that winter was not retreating. The hut gradually turned into a snow cave. Snow accumulated on the roof, creating a huge load, but at the same time serving as an excellent insulator. It covered the windows, plunging the dwelling into semi-darkness. The exit to the outside turned into a tunnel dug through the snowdrift. Sometimes the trapper cleared the entrance so as not to be completely blocked. The snow could put pressure on the walls, forcing the hunter to constantly check the strength of the structure. He listened to the crunch of ice and tried to figure out if the house was in danger of collapsing. If the roof began to sag, he added additional supports. It was not easy, especially in the dark and cramped conditions, but otherwise the hut might not survive the winter. Nature itself turned his shelter into a part of the landscape. At night, the trapper slept by the fire, wrapped in furs. His sleep was that of a creature in semi-hibernation. He woke up to throw wood on the fire, prepare a simple meal, and go back to sleep. The storm outside was not an event, but a state in which he lived for months. This state turned every night into a repetitive ritual of survival. Sometimes the hunter felt as if the walls were closing in on him from the cold. The furs he wrapped himself in were his best protection against the night frost. The fire gave him not so much warmth as the confidence that he would live to see another day. Every time he woke up, he listened to see if the snowfall was continuing. Often, the only answer was silence, concealing the power of the elements. The main threat was not the storm itself, but its consequences. If there was too much snow, he could not get out to check his traps. This meant no fresh meat and no valuable fur. His sleep was peaceful within the walls of his home, but he was anxious about his future. His supplies could run out faster than the elements allowed him to move. For settlers who chose the wooded areas of the Rocky Mountains or the Pacific Coast, wood was the primary building material. The log cabin, or log cabin, became as much a symbol of the frontier as the soddy, but it offered a completely different level of comfort and protection, especially during night storms. These houses were the pinnacle of individual construction. Building a log cabin required tremendous labor and specific skills. Trees had to be felled, stripped of branches and bark, and then fitted together. The main task was to minimize the gaps between the logs. These gaps, called chinking, were the Achilles heel of any log cabin. They carefully caulked them with whatever was at hand: moss, clay, wood chips, and sometimes even rags. The quality of this work determined how warm the house would be. A poorly caulked log cabin was as drafty as a plank shed, negating all the advantages of massive walls. At night during a storm, life in a log house was different from life in a sod house. Wooden walls were not as soundproof as earthen ones. The settlers could hear the wind roaring in the crowns of the pine and spruce trees surrounding the house. This sound was higher and more piercing than the rumble on the open plains. The house breathed and spoke. Under the gusts of wind, the logs could creak and groan slightly. This was alarming to the newcomers, but the experienced settlers knew that it was a sign of the flexibility of the structure. The log house did not resist the wind to the death, like a stone building, but slightly played, taking the blows. The main advantage of a log cabin was a large stone or adobe hearth or fireplace. It provided much more heat than a small cast iron stove in a sod house. And fuel, firewood, was abundant right outside the door. The family could keep a large fire going all night without having to economize on every twig. Sleeping in a log house during a storm was relatively comfortable. People lay in their beds, listening to the wind howling in the forest and the crackling of the fire in the hearth. The heat was constant, and the threat from the elements was minimal. Strong winds could knock down a tree, and that was the main danger. But choosing the right location for the house reduced this risk. Winter blizzards in the mountains were also easier to endure in a log cabin. The house was not completely covered with snow like a sod house or dugout, although the snow drifts against the walls could be huge. The wooden walls did not get damp like earthen ones, and it was dry inside. It was a dry, warm cold that was easy to cope with. However, log cabins had their own problems with water. Rain did not seep through the roof if it was well made of shingles, wooden tiles, but water could seep through poorly caulked cracks in the walls. During heavy rain and wind, drops of water could get inside, forcing the owners to check and repair the caulking again and again. A log house was a fortress, but a fortress that required constant maintenance. It provided a high level of protection from storms, but in return required vigilance from the owner. Sleep in such a house was the sleep of a master who was confident in his creation, but always ready to throw wood on the fire or plug a new crack that appeared in the wall. The geography of the frontier was incredibly diverse, and survival methods changed along with the landscape. In the arid Southwest, in the territories of Arizona and New Mexico, settlers faced a completely different climate in different storms. There was no turf or abundance of trees here. The main building material was clay or adobe. Adobe is a sun-dried brick made from a mixture of clay, sand, water, and straw. This technology was borrowed from local Indian tribes and Spanish colonists. Adobe houses were perfectly suited to the desert climate. They were built with flat roofs and very thick walls. The main advantage of adobe is its enormous thermal mass. During the day, under the scorching sun, the thick clay walls heated up very slowly, keeping the interior cool. At night, when the temperature in the desert dropped sharply, the walls began to slowly release the heat accumulated during the day, maintaining a comfortable temperature inside. There were two main types of storms in the desert: violent dust storms known as haboobs and sudden summer monsoon showers. An adobe house was excellent protection against both. During a dust storm, the thick, massive walls and small windows prevented dust from entering as it did in plank houses. During a nighttime haboob, the family could sleep peacefully. The wind roared outside, but inside it was quiet and the air remained clean. The walls did not vibrate or groan. It was like being in a bunker, completely isolated from the outside world. Summer monsoons brought another threat: water. Rainstorms in the desert were short but incredibly intense. It seemed as if a wall of water was falling from the sky. The main vulnerability of adobe was its solubility. An unprotected clay wall could simply melt under heavy rain. Therefore, the settlers learned to protect their homes. They covered the walls with a thick layer of lime plaster or more durable clay. Flat roofs had special channels for quick water drainage. At night, during such a downpour, the family heard the deafening drumbeat of water on the roof and ground. Sleeping in an adobe house during a downpour was a test of the roof's strength. People listened to the sounds, fearing leaks. If the roof leaked, it was a disaster. The water could wash away the supporting beams or even the walls themselves. But in a properly built house, people were completely safe. The most comfortable sleep was on a normal, non-stormy night. While the temperature outside could drop to near freezing, it was warm inside an adobe house. The family slept, sheltered by the heat that the house had absorbed from the sun. It was passive, natural heating. In this way, the settlers of the Southwest used the very essence of their region, the sun and the earth, to create shelters. Their nights were protected from sudden temperature changes and fierce but short storms. They slept in houses that were an extension of the desert itself. We have seen how settlers built shelters from wind, snow, rain, and dust. But no physical shelter could completely protect them from the main challenge of a stormy night: fear and isolation. The most important battle for sleep and survival took place not outside, but inside the mind of each settler. People knew well that even strong walls could not drown out their own thoughts. Therefore, the ability to remain calm became no less important than the ability to build a house. Many settlers admitted that the silence that fell inside their homes during the storm was more oppressive than the wind. People had no opportunity to distract themselves with the familiar noise of the city or their neighbors. Even pets behaved differently on such nights, becoming restless or hiding. All this intensified the feeling of vulnerability. Fear became almost palpable, as if it were another person in the room. Night on the frontier, especially during a storm, was a time of absolute darkness. Without electricity or street lighting, the only source of light was a kerosene lamp or the fire in the stove. When the storm raged outside, this small point of light became the center of the universe for the family. People tried to stay close to it because the light created a sense of security. Even a faint flame gave hope that the house would withstand the onslaught of the elements. Sometimes the lamp was placed closer to the window so that at least a hint of movement outside could be seen. This did not provide a real view, but it helped to feel connected to the outside world. Children were told stories about travelers and heroes to calm them down before bedtime. The light played the role of a guardian, preventing fear from completely taking over the house. In this way, the family created a small world around themselves that remained stable despite the storm. To get through the night, people relied on routine. Evening rituals became extremely important. Dinner, even the most meager, eaten together, was an act of unity. After dinner, it was time for quiet activities that helped distract from the roar of the elements. These familiar activities served as a reminder that life goes on, even when the weather is raging outside. Sometimes the family would repeat the same conversations, which became part of their evening routine. People discussed the past day, plans for spring, or news they had heard from their neighbors. This simple conversation helped maintain the bond between family members. It kept them from sinking into anxious thoughts. Such moments became a real source of support. Women often sat down to sew or mend clothes by lamplight. The steady tapping of a needle darning a sock or the creaking of a spinning wheel were soothing, homely sounds. They created an island of normality amid the chaos. Men could repair harnesses, sharpen tools, or simply sit silently by the fire. Everyone did something that helped them stay calm. Sometimes the women told stories from their lives, reminiscing about their former homes or their journeys to the West. This created the feeling that the storm was only a temporary obstacle, not a permanent threat. Young children observing the calmness of the adults also became more confident. The house was filled with the quiet sounds of work, and they became louder than the howling wind. In this way, the family built an inner fortress that the storm could not penetrate. The history of the frontier is not only a history of great achievements, but also a history of quiet nights spent fighting the elements. We see how settlers, finding themselves in new, hostile conditions, showed miracles of ingenuity and fortitude. From dugouts dug into hills to massive sod houses and adobe fortresses, each dwelling was a response to a specific challenge from nature. These people learned to sleep amid the roar of tornadoes, in snow-covered huts, and in rooms filled with dust. Their sleep was not rest, but a truce in the eternal war with the weather. They proved that the human spirit is capable of adapting to any conditions and creating a home even where it seems impossible to live. What other aspects of daily life and survival on the frontier would you like us to cover in future issues? Perhaps you are interested in how they obtained water in arid regions, or how they preserve food without refrigerators? Suggest your topics in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss new stories about the exploration of the Wild West.